Welcome everybody to the Ethics of Social Media in Graduate School. It's going to be really exciting to talk today to three amazing upcoming scholars that I know from the Professors for the Future program at UC Davis. I thought we'd start just by going around and introducing ourselves and tell us a little bit about sort of what your engagement is with social media to give us an idea of where you're coming from. So we'll start over here with...
All right, I'm Holly Bick. I'm a postdoc in the UC Davis Genome Center, and I use social media as a professional tool, so blogging, Twitter, and I actually have a paper in PLOS Biology focused on how to use social media if you're a researcher.
Hello, my name is Valerie Feldman. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology, and I've been previously a bit of a Luddite about social media, but finding that it's more and more important to brand myself and sort of get my name out there and make my references, my citations available to people, and so they can get to know me a little bit. And so I use Facebook and Twitter. Twitter is mostly professional for me. LinkedIn I definitely use, and that's primarily a way that I actually keep up with my students and my mentees.
And I'm Dan Villarreal. I'm a PhD candidate in Linguistics here at UC Davis, and I primarily use social media for personal purposes, communicating with friends, venting about whatever happened that day or that week, posting interesting political stories and whatnot. But I do use, and that's mostly Facebook. I don't know, I said mostly. I don't have a Twitter, I don't have a Tumblr, I don't have a MySpace still, I don't think. I should probably check on that. But I use academia.edu, which I guess counts as social media.
I forgot about that, yeah.
It's kind of a professional social media hybrid, anywho. I do use that for posting my CV, posting papers, and whatnot. So primarily personal, but also a little bit professional.
And I'm Cutcha, Baldy. I'm a PhD candidate in Native American Studies, and I use social media for everything, to communicate with my friends, but also academically, and then sort of reaching beyond academia to kind of educate people about Native American Studies and issues sort of outside of the academic spectrum in my writing. I wanted to start with sort of, if you guys could say what you think of the things that you do online professionally, what do you think is the most useful that you've done so far?
I would say building a professional website so that the first thing that people see when they Google me is my curated website of the things that I want them to see. So including my publications, my research interests. At this point I should probably say that I work in marine genomics and computational biology. And yeah, it's just a place for me to update people on what's happening in my professional life.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up academia.edu because I forgot about that, and I, being not super savvy with social media previously, I think mostly I've been a consumer, and academia.edu is a great place to consume new stuff that's happening. So I follow the people whose research I'm interested in, and I can view all of their updated articles, and sometimes they'll be there before it's even published in the journal, and so that's really exciting. For Twitter is really where I feel like I'm trying to start branding myself and actually have my academic thoughts out there, and be connected to people, and it's really fun at conferences to sort of stay connected and check in about what's happening at the conferences and what you're learning from each other.
Yeah, I did make a web page on my department's kind of website, so that I could, as Holly said, kind of be proactive in putting that out there, and I've had that up there for a few years now.
And when it comes to being an academic, because Valerie had brought up this idea of creating a brand or being a brand, and I don't know if that's sort of a new conversation, if that's something that I think our and future generations might understand, but people who are slightly older might be like, why create a brand, or what does a brand look like, or what is that important for? It's kind of a weird way to sort of put yourself out there, to call yourself a brand.
Well, yeah, here's the way I think about it is anytime you're interacting with people out there in the world, you're putting forth certain identities, right? You're telling people certain ways about you, certain things about who you are and whatnot. With the internet and putting stuff on social media, that all of a sudden gets less ephemeral, right, than when it's just spoken in a conversation or written in a private letter to somebody. So all of a sudden it becomes important to think of it not as the way that your interactions create your identities in the moment, but the way that you're doing that in a more durable way.
I also think it's driven by social media being primarily used a lot in marketing. So networking is a type of branding. We just haven't called it that before. But now with social media, there's this spillage from kind of the advertising marketing world into, you know, our academic life. So maybe we're just becoming more comfortable with calling it branding ourselves because it's more obvious.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more information, there's a lot more people who've entered academia too, and so you sort of want to stake out a space so people can find you when they're looking for you, and you're trying to sort of make your place as a new scholar, right?
No, but what I also think is interesting sometimes that I come up against is I think that there's a difference between what makes a good academic brand and what makes a good brand in general. So do you consider that? Do you think about like, I'm trying to be a good academic brand here, I'm not trying to be like a popular writer brand or sort of somebody putting that sort of like what does a good academic brand look like?
I think it really varies depending on your goals and who you want to interact with. So there's this idea that we talk about a lot of in-reach versus outreach. So if you just want to talk to people in your own discipline, you're kind of doing in-reach. So maybe you only need 50 Twitter followers if you're in a small discipline, but if those 50 people are representative of all the people you need to talk to, then there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to do outreach, you want to talk to the public, you want to be Neil deGrasse Tyson and have 3 million followers, then, you know, that's also a successful academic brand. It's just geared towards kind of different goals.
So tell us a little bit about what your brand is. What have you put out there? What's Holly's brand?
My brand is actually very adequately illustrated by my Google Images. So I'm a marine biologist who's transitioned over to computational biology, and I try and infuse my personality into my science. So actually, one of the images that comes up is sort of a little bit of fashion blogging that I do on Tumblr, which is also part of my brand because my long-term goal is to dispel the notion of a stereotypical scientist. So, you know, being young and female, and I like to think fashion forward. I mean, that's not what you would think of as a scientist.
I don't think I've thought really all that consciously about my brand yet. Like, I'm just starting to think about these things and what I'm putting out there. So as far as my pictures that come up, I just look like a friendly nerd, and that's fine with me so far. In terms of like my academia.edu and LinkedIn and my Facebook and Twitter, it's really me sort of trying to take a step forward just to show that I'm an engaging and engaged scholar. Like, I really think of Twitter, I was so down on Twitter when I first came across it, and now I'm like, oh, I see what this is, because it seems like a place, it's like having a little mini public sphere to talk about issues that are really important to me. Political and academic, and those often overlap for us in sociology. And so I am not thinking so much about branding yet, but I feel like I'm moving towards that area, right? Like, I know I need to have a website, and I know I should have a domain name that's ValerieFeldman.com or whatever. I think it's probably already taken, but you know, I should be staking out those things and presenting myself.
The Valerie Feldman.
The ValerieFeldman.com. Right, so I should be staking that area, but I feel like actually in the past year I've been trying much more to do that, because I think as a graduate student I wasn't certain and I didn't feel confident in doing that, and so now I'm starting to say, look, I'm a full-blown academic scholar, I can do this stuff, and part of that is the branding, so that's like the process of identity formation for me as well.
So as you sort of move into this idea of like branding or putting yourself out there on social media, do you have guidelines or ground rules that you follow as you're sort of putting it together? Is there anything that you would sort of put out there as the thing that you go, that's some kind of my ground rule for what I'm doing here?
Yeah, I think I try to be roughly the same person in my academic persona that I am most of the rest of the time. And granted, that might be a trivial statement because most of the time I am doing academic stuff and interacting with fellow academics. But like, for example, my both on my academia.edu and my department page, the description both start with "Hi!" exclamation mark. Because I don't know, I like to think of myself as someone who's friendly. Okay, yeah, cool. So I nailed it.
I try and censor the inane things, so yes, sometimes I get really excited about the design they make on the top of my latte, but there's way too many people that post those on Instagram, so I try to refrain unless I'm super, super excited. So yeah, just generally things that people hate on social media, like posting about your lunch or... Definitely not on
You do that
Twitter.
ironically.
Sometimes I do, yeah. I don't tend to blog about my own research projects until the paper is published. So I will blog about other people's papers because it makes me read papers. And then when I do publish my own paper, I write quite a detailed blog post for a lay audience because it serves as a resource for journalists too. And particularly if your study gets picked up in the press, you'll have just journalists emailing you and they're all on deadlines and they want to know about your paper and talk to you. So it's easy and it's time saving to have a blog post pre-written so you can say, hey, thanks for the interest. Here's the blog post I wrote explaining the paper with some of the questions that you probably have because a lot of journalists have the same questions. And then if you have any follow-up questions or anything's not clear, then we can talk on the phone. So that's sort of a time-saving mechanism I use for my own research.
Yeah, I feel like a blog is good because it kind of forces you to do that, right? Like you have to use plain language and make it understandable by a broader audience, depending on who your blog is targeted towards, right? Because it could be targeted towards your academic audience, but it sounds like yours is more broadly focused.
Yeah, I mean, we still have a lot of marine scientists that read the blog, but then we have a lot of public people that read the blog. And it's good to think like a journalist in these situations because journalists are always asking, why is this important? How does this fit into what we already know? And so they're really focusing on the big picture. And if you can condense it into a summary to kind of get across the main picture, and I think that's what people are looking for.
And that's a good professional practice anyway, right? Like you should always be able to translate the contribution and why your work is important to anybody, right?
And yeah, something that comes from the branding or marketing side of things is you should have kind of a 30-second elevator pitch that you can tell to anyone about what your research is on, because you'll be surprised at how many times it actually comes up and people are interested, or even at a job interview when you have a diverse audience of researchers, but they're not in your field necessarily, so you need to be able to kind of get across to them very quickly what you do.
Here's an idea. Maybe I'll do this. For each of my research papers, record a literal elevator pitch for each of those, just a little 30-second soundbite, and post it next to each bullet point. Click here for elevator pitch. I need a better name for it. But I think that could be really useful, especially because people would go, oh, I only have to invest 30 seconds to figure out what this is all about. And in a social media kind of landscape and I guess a kind of user experience of software landscape in which we had to measure effort in clicks, telling people, hey, you can learn about my research in only 30 seconds would be a useful tool.
So when you think about sort of, I'm sure people have heard like horror stories about people who have posted something either on Twitter or on Facebook or a picture on their Instagram that then people find either inappropriate or keeps them from getting a job, or is there a way in which you would give advice to people about combating against some of these issues of like, well, what happens if my Twitter suddenly becomes the reason people don't want to bring me in for job interviews?
I think most of those horror stories relate to people being idiots on social media. I mean, there's a lot of stories about, someone posted a drunk photo on Facebook and then they weren't hired. It's like, well, maybe you shouldn't be posting those pictures on Facebook. I do think social media is very forgiving. I mean, if you see the comment is inappropriate, you can delete the tweet and apologize for it and write a blog post about it. And if it's a genuine mistake and people know that it's kind of out of character, I don't think it will hurt you.
I kind of agree. And then on Facebook, you have privacy filters that you should always be checking, and make sure you log off and look at your stuff on Facebook to see what's actually coming up, because maybe you thought that drunken photo was private and it's not.
Right.
And
you have some really kind of stringent rules for students in discussing classes.
I do. I don't discuss students that I have currently in my classroom, and then I also don't usually write about classes that are currently happening. I sort of wait, because then to me it becomes like the amalgam of all my classes, so you don't know which one it's from. I'm just like one time in class, and it wouldn't be necessarily from this quarter. It could be from any quarter of a class that I taught.
Yeah. I do think, though, that I do not have a policy about never talking about any classes that I'm teaching or TAing for at the time, because I think I've actually had some pretty productive conversations on Facebook about like quandaries in a class, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've got so much grading to do, like, will you all help me figure out like a good strategy for doing this? And I think sometimes you can have productive conversations with peers about those sorts of things in a way that, it's okay to talk about that. It's sort of like your professional development among peers, and I think that that's fine. But I think that's really it. I try really hard not to disrespect my students.
Do you think you had to think about this though? Because I'm thinking about, we're sort of advanced graduate students who have been in school for a while, and when you get people who are coming into graduate school, I mean, they're a generation of people who always had social media. Like, they've always been interacting in a social space. Facebook is old to them. MySpace didn't exist. Like, and it's sort of like a different way of thinking. Like, I've always had this social persona that I've been able to present. And do you have to then start, like, how do you help them to engage in thinking about what they now need to think about that they're in graduate school in terms of what's happening on their Facebook or in their Instagram? I know people in Instagram will post, like, pictures or short videos of, like, look, we got a bottle at this table and we're partying around at this club.
Rich kids.
Yeah. And you kind of think, like, okay, that's something that, maybe as you were an undergrad and you grew up with this, that was something people did, but now you're going into graduate school. Do you think it changes? Like, suddenly you have to start thinking about different things?
I think this exercise of Googling yourself or sort of having someone look through your Facebook profile is a good exercise. I know when I was on the fence about Facebook for a while because professional people kept friending me, and then I'm just finally like, all right, fine, I'll accept your friend request. But before I do, I'm going to go and delete all these pictures from my undergrad, because I joined Facebook pretty early in 2005, I think. So, that was most of my undergraduate career. Well, the last part of it was on Facebook. So, I had to delete a lot of pictures and, ski trips and all these personal stuff that I put on Facebook, because that was sort of the era, too, where everyone was just kind of enamored with these tools and posting everything online because it was cool and it was fun, and no one really thought about the long-term implications of that. So, it's possible to go and delete and hide things, and I think if you're going to go down the route where you want a professional social media presence, the first thing you need to do is to do these steps. So look at what you have out there already, Google yourself, look at your Facebook pictures, hide everything, and then make that step to kind of transitioning to the professional stage.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that prospective, like postdocs and do you think they really sit down and actually Google and go through what they find, in terms of social media or even sort of what's present on the web?
You never know.
I think Googling is kind of expected. Like, if I were applying for a job and a student said, yeah, so I Googled you and I found this, I wouldn't flinch, because I'd be like, of course you Googled me. Or, if you're engaged and you wanted to find out more, that's the first thing you do, right?
Do you think about like social media policy in terms of, in another direction, people like twittering about you or what you're saying, or like your class twittering about you, or talking about you?
It's really funny that you mentioned that, Cutcha, because just the other day after the meeting that we were both at, I got on Facebook, and the first post on the top of my newsfeed was a friend of mine from Sac State who had seen your talk there on Tuesday and was like, it was awesome. And I was like, this is highly ironic. Especially because when you get to be someone who's really well known within the discipline, in a lot of ways it's like your celebrity, albeit on a much smaller and much less glamorous scale. But people are gonna talk about you in a public forum with the expectation that you're not going to see it, and you probably won't in a lot of cases. I don't know, I'm actually kind of looking forward to that day, because that means my name will be out there.
Do you consider that when you're presenting yourself? Do you think like it's always up for grabs what I'm saying, the way that I'm presenting myself in a meeting or even like at a conference, that somebody could record me, take a picture of me and put it up? Like, is that something that you consider?
Gee, I hadn't, but now I will. Usually I think what I'm saying is not important enough for anybody to like do that sort of stuff, but the more I move on in my professional development, the more I think like, oh yeah, that's true. And I actually had a conversation with a faculty member who was like, yeah, now I actually have to say, like, please do not record me without pre-approval from me, like in class, because I don't want you to post my lectures on YouTube or whatever. And I had never thought about that, but yeah, some students do. But then at the same time, I'm like, well, what if that helps that student's learning, and like maybe that's an okay thing. So I haven't quite grappled with that, but I know it's something that I'm gonna have to think about more as I go on with teaching and conference presentations and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think teaching considerations are different. At conferences, I assume everything's public.
It's
So if
public,
I don't want
yeah.
people to see it, I don't talk about it.
Right.
When I'm tweeting other people's talks, I make sure that it's published data. So if it's unpublished results, I probably wouldn't take a picture and tweet it unless I specifically say. You can't stop people from going around poster halls with iPads and taking pictures of all the posters. Like, that happens. And your poster is up, and you can't stand there all the time, and you can't control what people do. So yeah, it's just a good idea to assume that conference presentations are just like Facebook, and people might see it. So if you don't want people to see it, don't talk about it or put it in your poster.
No pressure.
Yeah, that's really odd. Thinking about that, I mean, I guess it makes sense, but it's also really odd to me because anytime I'm presenting something at a conference, I feel like I want to be really proactive in pushing it out there. And part of that is that if I'm presenting it at a conference, I know I'm putting it out into the ether. And even if it's not published, in fact, in my discipline, it's really uncommon to present something at a conference that's been published. I don't know. I don't think it's done. It's real. The conference is kind of a proving ground slash sounding board. Yeah.
In the academic community, social media use is not necessarily viewed well by some people, and I think this is a kind of a generational gap thing, and just people don't understand how you can use social media. So there's a lot of misconceptions about inane things and talking about your lunch and not necessarily seeing it as a networking tool.
That's totally what I thought Twitter was. I thought it was just people like posting like, oh, check out this cupcake I'm eating, it's awesome, and it's not always that way. Depends who you're following.
And then does your department know about your social media sort of interactions and accounts, or has that ever come up in terms of who you are as a representative of the department that you're from?
Yeah, I don't think my department cares. They only know to the extent that I'm Facebook friends with some faculty, or am followed by faculty in our department, and we don't really talk about it. I feel like we should, because some of our faculty have really great social media outreach and public blogs and websites and things, but they don't tend to talk about it at all, and so neither do I.
Yeah, no, that has not come up at all, which I think is kind of... I think if I were to pin down a reason or even ask the chair or different professors why, I think they would probably say, well, it's not my or our province to do so. But I wonder if they should. I wonder to what extent, because, one thing that you're always told if you're a member of a certain organization that's traveling, for example, is be respectful because the things that you say and do are going to reflect on our organization.
Yeah, because because of my blog, I've been called sometimes by like journalists who want quotes about some story they're writing. And when they would write about me, they would say, she's a PhD candidate at UC Davis in Native American Studies. So that was my credentials. It's interesting that you don't get a lot of training on creating your brand or presenting yourself, and yet you are sort of tied to and a representative of this department and this place. Some people think of social media as an actual presence, like you are a person on social media as well as in sort of a real life interaction. So it's the same thing, like you wouldn't police my real life interaction with somebody because that would be a form of censorship. It's the same thing with social media. I think that people of sort of older generations who are in charge of institutions, they don't think of social media that way. They think of it very much as like a written document that you then need to get like permission for, or you need to figure out how to sort of go through these policies. So almost like you're supposed to look every time you want to do a tweet and make sure it's meeting all of these standards, and then not knowing that this is sort of like they wouldn't expect you to do that when you were talking to somebody in real life.
I mean, and faculty are protected by academic freedom, so I think what you say as a quote is not necessarily interpreted as the university's viewpoint because of the academic freedom. But for grad students, I don't know if you're bound by the same rules because you're sort of in a different structure.
So I'm wondering if people want to take a moment to say sort of one thing that they think graduate students should keep in mind as they build their social media and online presence. And I'm thinking about mostly graduate students who are starting this sort of social media process. what do you think they should keep in mind as they're doing it? Like, what do you think is the most useful thing?
I would say think about your goals. So what do you want to accomplish? Before you even do anything, sign up for any accounts, figure out what your goals are. Figure out what platform is going to be best for your message. So maybe you want to post science photography, in which case a visual blog might be a good way. But if you want to talk about research in short form, you don't have that much time. Maybe Twitter is more appropriate. So yeah, goals hand in hand with picking the tools, and sort of also don't feel like you have to do everything. You don't have to use every single tool. You don't have to have a Tumblr and a Facebook and a Twitter and stuff. You can have one account or a couple accounts that complement each other.
I think Holly just summed it all up really, really nicely. But I think the thing that I would tell new graduate students is what sort of public presentation of self do you want to put out there? Because it really is searchable. People can find you. Things are documented. And if you do need to have that division of private and public life, that's totally fine, and you can figure out ways to do that. But make sure that you're very clear about your privacy settings and what is actually available to people completely publicly, right? Because when you do post in social media, it's a public place. It's not like having a private conversation in person like we're doing right now, except that there's a recording, right? It's out there in perpetuity for people to find.
Think about my sage piece of advice is to think about your audience and who you want your audience to be and these can be and probably should be different for given channels, but even if you're just starting out, you may not have much of an audience at first, eventually if you cultivate a certain presence that is intended for a certain audience, that audience will come to you.
So I would think about like the kind of academic you want to be, and then go for that. And it took me a little bit to figure out that there is a difference between the popular academics that you see on the Daily Show and the academics that are like in a Research One institution, like doing research. Because I do know that sometimes academics will look down on popular academics and sort of the work that they're doing, and so I think it's sort of a matter of deciding the kind of presence you want to have.
Can I add one more bit of advice I just thought of?
Yeah.
Take a headshot. Not like a professional one. Like don't go to LA. I mean, you can if you want. Like that's awesome. There's nothing wrong with that. But like mine is just like me standing in front of a bunch of books in our linguistics library, because there will come a point where you're going to want to put that up there, and you're going to want something that's like more appropriate and professional than just what you've been putting on OkCupid, right?
Yeah, or your selfie.
Professional headshots are actually, I make a case for this, you get much better pictures and they're really not that expensive. So even if you just have a photographer friend to take you through the lab or at your desk and take some pictures. I mean, my pictures I've tried to take myself are some of them are cringeworthy. Yeah.
So let's take a moment to plug our social media presence. If you can tell people where they can find you if they're interested in learning more about you. Say your name again and sort of what department you're from, and then where they can find you online.
Cool. So I'm Holly Bick. You can find me at hollybick.com. And I have a link to all my blogs there. So I do a variety of different accounts. But the main blog I contribute to is Deep Sea News. So deepseanews.com, which is a marine blog.
Cool. I'm Valerie Feldman, PhD candidate in sociology. I study the politics of prostitution and trafficking. That sounds interesting, right? I should have a blog. Don't have a blog yet, but you can find me on academia.edu and just search for Valerie Feldman and sociology, and I'll pop up. And you can find me on Twitter at VA Feldman, not at V Feldman, at VA Feldman. My middle name is Anne.
And I am Dan Villarreal, PhD candidate in linguistics at UC Davis. You can find me at my academia.edu page, ucdavis.academia.edu/Dan Villarreal, no spaces. That'll also link you to my department personal page. You can't find my Facebook unless I know you, and God bless you if you can find my highly ironic Instagram.
And I'm I'm Cutcha, Risling, Baldy. If you're listening to this, you have already found my website, so congratulations. X marks the spot. You can also find me on Twitter at Cutcha Baldy, or you can find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, so if you look up Cutcha, Risling, Baldy, you can find that. Thank you, everybody, for coming and talking
Thank you.
today.
Yeah, thank you.
So everybody say bye.
Bye.
Bye.